Welcome. My name is Joe Paprocki, and I'm the National Consultant for Faith Formation at Loyola Press, a Jesuit ministry in Chicago. And it is my pleasure today to be hosting this webinar, Answering Your Kids' Toughest Questions, a webinar with my dear friend Julianne Stans. Hi, Julianne.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Joel. Good morning, everybody. I saw we have people from Singapore and Egypt and Luxembourg and
Oh,
Malta, and just from out the road at some of my favorite parishes here in Northeast Wisconsin. It's good to be with everyone.
how wonderful. Thanks for being with us today, Julianne, and to everyone else for joining us. In just a moment, we'll formally introduce Julianne, and she'll be able to tell you a little bit more about herself and her wonderful book, The Catholic Parent Survival Guide, Straight Answers to Your Kids' Toughest Questions. And believe me, she's handled a few of them from her own kids. We're going to hear some of those stories. We are in a webinar format, which means that you will not be able to unmute yourself or to turn on your video camera. You'll just be viewing myself and Julianne, and then a little later on, our colleague and friend Denise will pop on to help with the Q&A. And speaking of the Q&A, please use that feature for any questions that you have for Julianne. Excuse me. We will have that Q&A later in the webinar, and don't hold back. She can take the tough questions, and please put those in the Q&A feature so we can differentiate them. The chat you can use to just introduce yourself, tell us where you're from. And once again, this is being recorded, and the recording will be made available to you in an email, and it will also be available online. We'll give that information at the end. So without further ado, let's jump into our presentation today by officially and formally welcoming Julianne. And Julianne, since the last time you and I did a webinar together, something in your bio has changed a little bit. You want to tell us that exciting news?
Yeah, this past year, I made a transition from diocesan life to working formally with Loyola Press as their outreach director for evangelization and discipleship. And
Yay!
many of you know that I've been a part of the Speaker Corps for 12 years, and I've written a number of books with Loyola Press. In fact, my first book was co-written with Joe. And
That's
so I've
right.
been orbiting around the Loyola Press family, and it's just been an honor to be formally working more closely with them.
We're so excited to have you, Julianne, and I think people around the country and around the world are excited to hear this news that Julianne is now with us at Loyola Press full time, and we're excited about the kind of things that you're going to be able to do for us, and that I look forward to the opportunities to work with you even more closely than we have in the past. And Julianne has a wonderful background of diocesan ministry, working in the Diocese of Green Bay. And of course, she is nationally and internationally known. She has spoken around the world, and including at the Vatican. And she is also a retreat leader, a storyteller. And most importantly, for our purposes today, she has a husband and three children, and they live in Green Bay. And it's the reason I say that's important is because if we have someone talking to us about a Catholic parent survival guide, it's probably good that they are speaking from their experience. So, Julianne, tell us just a little bit more about your family.
Yeah, Wayne and I have been married for 16 years. He's just an incredible support to me and has always been just so encouraging. He's the backbone, I often say, of our family life because as I was working formally and on the road so much, he was holding everything together, and we would do the same for each other. We have three children, a high schooler, a middle schooler, and an elementary school. And so I wanted to be able to reflect their experiences and the experiences of parents and grandparents and teachers who are working with kids from multiple grade levels and teachers who are working with kids, because the questions that your children ask definitely change over time,
Yeah.
and they can be great conversation starters with regard to our faith.
And it's just so wonderful that you shared that picture with us. You have a young man there who's now the tallest person in the family, and that's just it's so hard to believe watching him grow up.
Yeah.
And then you have a couple of that are a little shorter than you, but not for much longer.
I am definitely, my daughter actually has, this was taken at Christmas.
Okay.
She is just starting to pass me up, and I'm the heels here, so that might. And then our youngest, Sean Patrick, he's in that 9-year-old age of like still believing but slightly suspicious. And so we're going to talk about that, when the questions change, what's happening developmentally as well.
Yeah, and you have a beautiful family, Julianne. Thank you for sharing the background and the picture with us as well. Um, and the kids are just lovely, but they are so real. I've seen you with them, and they have so much energy, and they keep you on your toes. And I think that is something that really helped you to write this book, the Catholic Parent Survival Guide. Probably not an easy book to write because parenting is not easy. So
Mhm.
tell us a little bit about the book, how it came about. Actually, we're going to delve into that in a moment or so. But just your thoughts behind this book
Mhm.
and what people might really glean from it when they get it in their hands.
Yeah, I wanted it to be really practical because I wanted it to be very applicable to any parenting situation, blended families, single parent families, families in all different ages and stages of life. That was really important to me. And one of the things that I recognized was the limitations of some of my own experiences, but the opportunity to learn from other parents. And so the wisdom that's in this book is twofold. I interviewed, I mean, many children from
Mm.
all different ages and stages of life, and so their questions are real questions posed by kids. I had 127 questions
Wow.
from different children. But then what I also did is I interviewed parents from all around the US and beyond, actually, because that was important to me too. And I wanted to harvest the gift of their experiences, families that were in different stages, that were parenting children at multiple levels, the boomerang parents,
Mm.
with the kids that were coming back from college
Yeah.
and just not leaving. They were having conversations. And so the book brings together insights, real questions from children at all different ages, and then wisdom and stories from parents in terms of how they address questions, but also the mistakes. Like, I missed this opportunity, and here's what happened. And then the real stories of this is where we connected again on that issue.
Yeah.
So you're going to see those things reflected, so that can give parents a wider variety of experiences to tap into.
Well, congratulations on the book, Julianne. It's a wonderful book. So it's called The Catholic Parents Survival Guide. You see it on your screen. There's also a QR code there if you'd like to scan that, and then you'll have the information for how to acquire the book from Loyola Press. Um, the book also is something that really was inspired by an encounter with, I believe it was your oldest son, who
Actually, it was my youngest.
the
Yeah.
youngest. Okay,
My
tell
little
us a
old
little bit
soul.
about this experience and how his question just made you sort of stop in your tracks and think, "Oh
Mhm.
my goodness, I'm going to have to be answering questions like this for the next 18 years."
Yeah, my youngest son he's a very introspective child. And so, if he asks a question, it's because he's thought about it a lot and hasn't figured it out and wants
Mm.
perspective on it. And so he came to me one day and he's like, Mom, I have a really important question to ask. And I said, What is it? And he said, Mom, what's the closest planet to heaven? And a lot of children at that 6, 7-year-old stage are interested in exploring space and planets and the
Oh yeah.
solar system and dinosaurs and all of that. And so I thought it was such a good question. And but the problem was, Joe, I didn't have an easy answer.
Yeah.
And then I realized something, and this scenario was the motivation for the book. I have lived, I have worked, I have ministered in the church for over 25 years at parishes, I've taught in schools, and I was struggling to answer the questions that my children had. And I realized something is that a lot of the formation that I had was great formation, great education. Like many of us, we get great formation and education, but it did not prepare me to answer the questions for my own children. I wasn't, and so I said to him, "Oh gosh, Sean, that's a great question." And that's a tip I would say is acknowledge that it's a good question,
Yes.
and then acknowledge that you need some time to think about it. And that's what I did. And then I was sitting maybe a week later, and it it just struck me. Jesus spent his earthly life here on Earth, so the closest planet to heaven has to be Earth, because Jesus lived, walked, is with us here, and so he teaches us how to get there. And so I went back to him and I said, I believe that the closest planet, Sean, to heaven is Earth, and here's why. And that led to a really great conversation about
Yeah.
Jesus and his humanity, but also we were starting to get into his divinity too.
Mm.
And heaven and earth. Bridging that conversation with Sean was that aha moment for me where I realized our kids are capable of having their own relationship with Jesus. They have their own interior spiritual lives. And how we guide and sherpa that spiritual life at that early age and all the way along is really important in terms of how they see God and the world
Yeah.
around them.
It's so amazing when we hear, get a peek, a glimpse into our children's, our grandchildren's brains and the things that they're thinking about and the things that capture their imagination,
Mm-hmm.
their curiosity. Um, and I think it just is staggering sometimes to realize the complexities that they're starting to deal with at such a young age. It kind of
Mm-hmm.
blows your mind, doesn't it?
Yeah, someone put in the chat, well, what are some of the most intriguing questions that you've heard from your children? I think if you're open to the questions and you're open in conversation, there are so many intriguing questions. Not
Mm,
just questions that are what questions, like what is happening at Mass or
yeah.
why do we do this, but questions that really, I think, tie in to, like you
Mm,
said, Joe, meaning and
yeah.
who is God. And I think that, when you look at research, particularly developmental research around young people today, they hunger so much for authenticity and meaning and value. And I think as parents, we forget our influence. So, this story I had shared with you, Joe, we are the biggest and largest influence in our children's
Hmm.
lives. And
That can be
um,
scary, huh?
I can, and I think that's something that we need to think about. This is a little story here that I want to share with you, but that it really illustrates this point. The first place that Jesus came, of all the ways God could have revealed himself to us on earth, he came as a baby in a family, which tells us that this is where God wants us really, truly to
Mm,
be living out our faith. And so one day, I was at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, where I've done some work over the last 14 years. And I was coming down the elevator with a good friend of mine who is a bishop. And my daughter, Ava, she was very young at the time, but she ran right up when the elevator door opened. Mom was here, and she came to me and she was like, "How was your day? And can we go for ice cream?" And then, "Oh, hello, how are you?"
mm.
You have that moment you're holding your breath, with your children, because she's in the presence of, a respected leader.
Hmm.
And this, like, my children are very normal. This is very normal for them. So she was her full self. And she said, "Who are you?" And he said, "Well, I'm Bishop so and so." And she said, "Oh, and what's your job?" And he said to her, my job is to safeguard the faith that's been passed on from Jesus to the apostles. And so that's part of my job. And she looked straight at me and she said, "Is that true, Mom? Is that what he did?" And I had that moment where I was like, "Oh Lord, you're having this real conversation." And he stopped me because he could see that I was had a little discomfort, and he said, "Julianne, it's true the world over. The word verify means to elicit truth.
Mm,
Children will elicit truth more from their parents than they would from a stranger.
yeah.
I'm a stranger to Ava. It doesn't matter what my role is in life, but she is verifying what I told you as to be real and true." And so
Yeah.
children won't talk about this point very much, but this is a huge principle for us, is that we are the biggest influence on the faith lives of our children, and trusted adults catechists,
Yeah.
teachers, and grandparents also share that place.
Absolutely, and I love the phrase that you chose to use, arch influencers. And it's amazing. I remember a year or two ago, I went to watch my grandkids ice skating at an ice rink, and it was like, lessons that they were participating in. And I noticed this in not just my grandkids, but in all the kids that were there. Anytime one of the children would fall, they would immediately look up to the stands to look for their parents, to see
Mm.
what what's my parents' reaction. Are they
Mm-hmm.
upset? Are they still proud of me? Are they? It just talk about the influence that they fall down, and the first thing they think of is, what does my mom think of me now? What does my dad think of me? And then, they see the parents saying, it's okay, get up. And, they get back up on the skates again. So arch influencer is just a great phrase that you've chosen. And as I said before, it can be intimidating, but also what a wonderful privilege that we have to be able to engage children at this age, right?
Yeah, I love that story, Joe. I think it emphasizes that point, that we do have an absolutely, irreplaceable role in the life of our children. And in the midst of life, which can seem busy and hurried, the opportunity to slow down and listen for those questions, and to be comfortable not having all the answers, but having some principles,
Yeah.
which we're going to get to today. That's where I think some of those incredible conversations can be just fertile ground for new life to come in the midst of that child's heart, so that they
Yeah.
can hear how God is speaking to them. Right? Because we
Yeah.
want them to have their own relationship with God, not just our relationship. We can pass on parts of how we see God, but ultimately that's part of the unique role that we have, is to guide them to discover who God is in their own lives.
Absolutely. I'm noticing a few questions are popping up in the Q&A, and that's a good thing. I want to remind people that if you have questions for Julianne, please put them into the Q&A, and in about a half hour or so, we're going to switch over to live Q&A. Denise is going to sift through the questions that are coming in and feed them to Julianne so she can answer them. Impromptu, is that the right word?
Yeah, they're great.
Yeah,
They're really great. And also, I would say to those that are listening in, because there's quite a few of you, if you have answers or if you have tips or principles, we're collecting those too.
yeah,
We'd like to hear your wisdom on some of these ideas as well. There's no right way, but there
yeah,
are good ways to share.
yeah. And let's start getting into some of the nuts and bolts here as well, because you tell some wonderful stories, and they're very inspiring. But you also get down to some, okay, here's some principles that I'd recommend. And for starters, you decided you wanted to talk a little bit about Socrates here. What's Socrates? How's he going to help parents in the 21st century?
So I think this is one of the most important principles for parents, which is to let the questions unfold naturally. Um, and so Socrates teaches us that the best questions are the ones that children can make the connection between what you're telling them and what is going on in their inner world. So, what I mean by that is, if a child comes to you with a question like, why do we have to go to Mass? And we're going to talk about that a little later.
Okay.
But be careful not to give them the answer right away,
Mm.
but to reframe the question and to say,
Mm.
why do you think we have to go to Mass?
Mm.
Who is God? Who do you think God is? That's a great question. Again, starting with the affirmative. That is a great question. I hear you. Let's talk about that. And then, um, who do you think God is? First of all, it allows for a couple of things. Developmentally, it allows to check for prior understanding. What has a child heard about God or going to Mass? And then often, particularly when it gets to older children, middle school and high school, there's often a scenario that's driving that. So say, for example, who is God? For a teenager, that's not a simple answer. What you're listening for there is belief and unbelief, but
Mm-hmm.
also, Mom, why do you believe in God? Because I may be struggling with that. So allowing that question to emerge allows you to listen for the context behind the question. And this isn't just something Socrates did. This is exactly how Jesus used two
Sure.
methodologies when he was with people. The first one is he told story, and then the second one is he asked and he reframed questions back. Here are
Mm-hmm.
some of the
Sure.
questions he was asking. What do you want me to do for you?
Mm.
Who do you say that I am? Where is everyone? Someone estimated that Jesus asked over 300 questions, but
Wow.
answered less than 10 directly.
That
So
says
it's a good
something.
methodology.
Yeah, I like that. I just finished a few days ago writing a little segment about catechists asking questions and how important that is,
Hmm.
and how we look to Jesus. I didn't realize that some people have summarized that it's over 300 questions. I mean,
Yeah.
that really does reveal that it's a part of his arsenal, his approach. And I like the fact that very often he would perform an action and then say, do you understand what I just did? And or tell a parable, and do you understand? Looking for meaning. So yeah, it's one thing that kids ask us questions, and we can rephrase them and turn them back on them to engage them, find out where is this coming from, what's at the heart of it. And sometimes, maybe you can speak to this, Julianne. Sometimes it's
Hmm.
just that they want to talk to you.
Yeah. And I think this is one thing that we in because things are moving so fast, sometimes we have a tendency to, yeah, and kind of get through the day. But if you can't get to the question right in the moment, it's okay to
Hmm.
say, because this is such a good question, I really want us to have some time later on. So if you let Mom finish making dinner and cleaning up, we're going to sit down. We're going to talk about that. So it honors the question, but it also honors the time that you have. And
Yeah.
I think that is okay. And then that's where you can actually buy a little time also to think through things. And Jesus did that too. He would say situations would unfold and he would pose a question, but then if you read in the scriptures, it says things like he would go away to pray, and then he came down and he talked to people.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so I think it's okay for children. In fact, I think it's great for children to see that and for them to hear you say something like, because that is such an important question and I value this time with you, I had a little time to pray so that I'd have the right answer, or the answer that's going to fit for us here in our family.
Yeah, and I think that, the giving our children the time of day, so to speak, I think is one of the profound ways that we bless them. We talk about, praying to God to bless us, let his face shine down upon us. In other words, just we want our parent, our father, our God, to
Hmm.
gaze upon us. And so when children ask you a question, if you let your gaze fall upon them, you're really blessing them. That's what they're looking for. They want to engage some eyeball to eyeball contact, and really
Hmm.
know that they have your attention. That's so important for children. How often kids are saying, Mommy, look,
Hmm.
hey, look at this." So yeah, we do them a huge favor by giving them that time of day. Um, Julianne, let's move into the book a little bit, and a little bit more, I should say, because you deal with some sections here, some very large questions. And one of the
Yeah.
first questions, and you hinted at this just a moment or two ago, is probably one of the first questions that children begin to ask. And my wife and I are waiting for our grandkids to start asking us this question now. Who is God?
Hmm.
Because they've seen at Christmas the nativity set, and Jesus. Just last week, two of our grandchildren were at their first wake that they went to,
Hmm.
and my grandson saw a crucifix up close as he knelt by the coffin. There was a large crucifix with the corpus on it, and he looked up to me and said, "Bumpa," which is what they call me, Bumpa. "Bumpa, what's that?" And so
Mm.
at some point I'm thinking, I tried to answer as I could, but at some point I'm going to have to explain that this is God. So Julianne, unpack this a little bit for us. How
Hmm.
do we respond when children ask us, who is God?
Yeah, it's a great question to ask. And I think this question can be posed in a couple of different ways. So I want to make a distinction here that will help, particularly catechist teachers, but also parents and grandparents who are on the line. There's four types of questions that we generally ask. We ask who questions, why questions,
Hmm,
what questions, and how questions.
okay.
And in general, particularly when we're working with children, what and how questions are usually much easier to answer. So, what do we, what happens at Mass? Okay. Um, how do I receive the Eucharist? But a question like, who is Jesus in the Eucharist? And why do we believe in the real presence of
Yeah.
Jesus in the Eucharist are very different. So the first thing I want you to listen to is for that what, who, why, and how, right?
Hmm.
Because I think that can be a good pointer for us in leaning in for detail. The question, if it's what is God, the first opportunity that you have is what feels um, it feels like the child believes that Jesus or God is a commodity, a thing, right? Like they
Hmm.
can be quantified. So shifting the question is that's a great question. We don't talk about what is God, but who is God because God is a person.
Okay.
So this is particularly with children today, with Santa and the Easter Bunny. They're living with figures
Yeah.
that are imaginary,
Yeah.
and this is something to be very aware of. When your child asks who is God, it's important that you talk about the God that you know. God is
Mm.
real in my life. God is love. God is the author of life. And as your child grows in age, layering that with God is a creator. And that's one of the first things we learn about God is a great creator. Now, children are very creative and artistic,
Sure.
so they resonate with that right away. Oh, God creates. So you're teaching them attributes, just like you would, like, who is grandma? Grandma is smart. Grandma bakes cookies. So
Mm.
you're layering that question. And I think that this is a really great point for us, but to shift from talking about the faith, like it's impersonal, to my faith, our faith, so that they see God as part and parcel of family life, as a real person that they can have a relationship with.
I love that, and it gets them thinking interiorly. Thinking about God is the person who speaks to your heart. That's
Hmm.
different than that's so different than the tooth fairy or whatever other
Yeah.
Santa and so on. That this is someone you have a relationship with, and to help them start to label that and put a name on it, and to understand that God is someone that you know. I love how you describe the different kinds of questions, and we're going to be getting into some of the questions that have to do with
Hmm.
Mass in just a moment. But it made me think of a question that my mom had. My mom passed away about 5 years ago now, God rest her soul. And she was not baptized when she was a child, a baby. And so by the age of 13, she was having questions, and her parents had many, many difficulties. So she couldn't ask her parents, but she asked her best friend's mother, who was Catholic, what do you get when you go up to the priest at Mass? Because she went to Mass with them and saw them go up there. And I'll never forget the answer she told me that her friend's mother said. Uh, she looked at my mom, who was again 13, and her nickname was Babe. She said, "Oh, Babe, the greatest gift you can ever imagine." How would you rate that answer, Julianne? I think it's spectacular, but it convinced my mom to become Catholic.
Oh my gosh, I think that is so beautiful. And I think it's such a great example of a real heartfelt, authentic
Yeah,
response versus the, standard or one liner, but an answer that connected heart to heart, right?
yeah.
And that's
Hmm.
going to move. That is where I think children see this is a real faith. And if she can have that, I can
Yeah.
have that too.
Yeah, I think that's so important that it comes from the heart. And I try to share that story with catechists quite often because we want to be technical, we want to get the answers right, we want to talk about real presence, transubstantiation, all important things. But I think we lead with joy. I think we lead with the heart,
Hmm.
and then we fill in some of those more,
Hmm.
cosmic questions, theological questions. Um,
Yeah.
and there's something about going to mass that
Hmm.
is going to raise questions, especially as Catholics. We
Hmm.
have so much sign, symbol, and ritual
Hmm.
that provokes questions. And so my grandson has already asked me a couple of times, when we go up to communion and we come back, what did you go up there for? So that's the kind of questions we're going to get. So talk to us a little bit about this because I think this is probably one of the biggest challenges Catholic parents
Hmm.
face is taking their kids to mass and first of all trying to get them to
And
not
mine are no
tear the place
different.
apart,
Yep.
but just to start to handle some of the questions. So what are the kind of questions and how do parents respond to these, Julianne?
Yeah, this is great, Joe. First of all, understanding and knowledge build upon each other. So when we look at questions around mass and some that are getting trickier, because we're going to progress to getting into some tricky questions, and the chat bar is reflecting that people want to talk about some of those more difficult questions.
Yeah.
This can be a very difficult one. And so I think one of the things I would say to you is to remember that iceberg theory of communication, which is that our words are like the top of the iceberg. They convey a lot, but tone, our body language underneath the iceberg conveys a lot more.
Hmm.
So when your children come to you, why do we have to go to mass? And you're like, we have to go to mass because you're conveying something about that experience to your child. So I would say be aware of that.
Yeah.
The second thing I would also say is sometimes teenagers in particular and middle schoolers are asking, why do we have to go to mass? Because we have friends who are Catholic and they are not going, right?
Yes.
So that's actually what might be behind the question more than mass is important to our faith. So again, that gradation of developmental psychology with children would tell you that as children are moving from concrete questions like, why do we go to mass to, and this is more formal operational thought, why do we have to go to mass? What
Hmm.
they're tapping into there is the intention behind why we go, right? The
Yeah.
meaning behind that. And so they can Google why do Catholics go to mass, older children, but what they can't Google are the reasons why that's important in your family. And I got a
Yeah.
great answer from a couple called Jan and Kevin. And they said, great answer from them was that this answer evolved with the ages of their children.
Mm.
And so they didn't want to just give them a standard answer. And I want to highlight that because I think this is an important one. They said is their answer to the question was, we need Jesus in the Eucharist to get us through the week. And then she says, Jesus loves you and wants you to be there with him.
Mm.
As they start at school and notice that not all their friends are at mass, we stressed in our family, different families have different traditions, and Sunday mass is our important way that we spend time together as a family.
Yeah.
And then she said we moved that then a little later as they got older. We need Jesus to work inside us through his body and blood to guide us. The longer we stay away, if we ever stay away, the further we drift. We need
Mm.
this. Mom and dad need this, and we need
Mm.
our family together. And so that answer evolved, and I thought that was such a great way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Mass keeps us centered. So they really talked about the personal reasons why they were going to Mass. And, there's research around it too, Joe, that talks about, you know, children and parents that go to Mass, the dynamics of their family and the quality look different. But I think it's tempting to talk about the benefits as some sort of insurance. um, I think it's more important to talk about the reasons that are important for your family. Like, we are struggling. I
Yeah.
lost my grandmother, I lost an aunt. I need mass because it's the one time I feel peace in my week.
Yeah.
All those personal reasons, whatever they are to you, tap into those in order to be able to address this question.
Yeah, and you really touched on something there too when you talked about, that question of, why do we have to go to mass? I recall when my kids were teenagers, this struck my daughter in particular. I remember one time at mass, she just looked so forlorn and didn't want to be there, and I was like, what is wrong? And she goes, don't you realize I'm the only one here my age? Sure enough, I mean, I look around and everyone is, in their 50s and 60s, and here's, our teenage daughter, and she's like, "Why am I here when none of my other friends are here?" And
Mhm.
so, it's a critical question, and it also makes me realize and think about what we're going to get into next, talking about prayer, because my daughter around the same time she was going to a Catholic school, and it was her turn to lead prayer in religion class. And
Mhm.
she was having the hardest time coming up with this prayer. And she was asking me for help. She figured, well, mom's the English teacher, dad's the religion teacher, so I know who to go to for this one. Um, but it was the first opportunity I had to help her to learn how to pray. And what I realized was that she was looking to be very formal in the prayers, like she was trying to
Mm.
write poetry. And if it was the first chance I got to say, "Oh, no, 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 prayer, Saint Ignatius said it should sound like one friend talking to another."
To another.
And so I had a chance to talk to her about prayer. So give us some of your wisdom about the kind of questions children have about prayer and how parents can respond.
I think your story is so beautiful, Joe. Reminds me of a couple of things around prayer, which is there's I think it's important to remind ourselves that we can pray for our children, we can pray with our children, and we can pray over our children.
Mm,
So if you're talking about how you teach your children to pray, there's more than one way to pray, right? And it's to pray in the way that's most comfortable for you. So if that's formal time at the end of the day, if it's formal mealtime prayer, that's great. Remember, a lot of this is planting seeds, but also it's to take those unexpected moments. A few years ago, a friend of mine gave me this idea. He's actually on the call today. So, Father Mac, thanks for this idea.
thanks.
But how many of us get new shoes when we start school, right? Or we go
Hmm.
school shopping with our kids to get school clothes, to get new shoes. But I just remember having little kids and how on and off the shoes would go every day. And so I know some of you are in that phase where your little kids need help with the shoes on and off all day. But something very, very simple that emphasizes this point is to make the sign of the cross over the soles of the feet of your children. And to do something as
Mm,
simple as making the sign of the cross and say, may God guide your steps today,
I love
and
it.
pop those shoes on.
Mm,
That's a way to pray with your children. The other
hmm.
thing is, if you have older children and they're stressed out about a quiz at school, take a moment before they leave the house in the morning to say, look, I know today is going to be a tough day. Just want to pray with you, just and take
Mm.
their hands or whatever, the shoulder if they're like my son, like, oh, mom, right? And just, I know today is going to be a tough day. And just close your eyes
Yeah.
and just listen. And for you to say, God our Father, I know he's having a tough day today. Be with him, you know, and to take that moment to step into that. That's praying over your child. And then
Beautiful.
some of the best times of prayer are contemplative prayers at night when my daughter, she is a bit of a nervous Nelly and all the worries she's had kind of come spilling out at night. So I often go into her room and I'll just take her hand and we'll lie down and we'll breathe nicely, contemplative prayer, and then we'll pray very slowly a Hail Mary, or sometimes we'll make up our own words, and then it just gets her to kind of come down from the day.
Mm,
That's that with, for, and over.
mm.
And you can use it in different ways.
I love that with, for, and over, and I especially love the idea of over. I think that's something that again parents can realize what an impact that can have. To
Hmm.
bless your child. Every child wants their parents' blessing, whether it's a formal blessing or just some sign that you validate and approve of me as a human being. And what a
Hmm.
beautiful thing to be able to do that by blessing them as they head out the door,
Hmm.
or blessing them as you're putting their shoes or their boots on during the winter time.
Or blessing their car keys when they get those car keys, and you
Oh
are
my goodness.
terrified that they're getting behind the wheel. You
Is
know,
your son at that age already?
he's starting driver's ed
Oh my
soon.
goodness. But
So,
you're praying a lot. But
yes, I am.
that's wonderful. And yeah, so I think these are critical moments for our children. And I'm glad that you're also speaking about the older children here too, because sometimes it can be maybe easier to teach the little ones, here's how to pray the,
Mhm.
glory be, or the Our Father, the Hail Mary, or say a couple of words to Jesus. But, a teenager, to
Mhm.
sit down and to spend time with them and to help them understand how they can talk to God, that's a little more challenging, isn't it?
Oh, totally. My son, and this is one of the things that I realized. A good friend of mine who has a brood of teenagers, she has six boys.
Mm.
She gave me this tip. At night, after a certain time, mom's brain is shut down, right? And dad's. And so, sometimes we are in bed around the 9:30 mark, and our teenager walks in and he's like, I want to talk to you about something. And I realized how easy it was to say, Ian, it's time for bed, and kind of shut down the conversation. But this is when he's holding all this tension from the day and he needs to release it. And so my friend gave me the tip of when they are willing to talk, be willing to listen.
Mm.
And so when we have had those moments at night, like he came in last night and there's a dance this month, like a snowball, a winter formal thing. This is his first one.
Okay.
And he's like, and I'd like to ask this girl, and how do I do that respectfully? And so we sat down and we talked. Great opportunity to talk about, the dignity of and respecting people and all of those great connections. And then
Mhm.
just before he left, he was like, "This is really good, Mom." And we're like, "Ian, do you want to pray right now?" And he turned and he's like, "Sure."
Nice.
And that's when his nervousness came out, because then we realized this conversation was precipitating possibly asking this young lady
Mm.
for the first time for a date. He'd
Yeah.
never done that before. And he
Okay.
just needed a little connectivity there with us. Um, so don't be afraid to step into those moments. They may shut you down. And that's to say, okay, I'll be praying for you, and to take those moments.
Thanks for saying that about that they may shut you down, because that does happen. And you might say, "Would you
Mhm.
like to pray about it?" And they're like, "Mom, or Dad." But to come right back and say, "Well, okay, that's fine, but I'll be praying for you," to assure them of that. I think that's such an important thing. But I love how you connected this with a very real situation. And our young people, especially our tweens and our teens, are
Mhm.
dealing with some very difficult and challenging issues. And so I'd like to jump ahead to talk a little bit more about that. And you don't necessarily have to get into the question that's on the screen here, Julianne, but it's an example of the kind of questions that our young people are bringing to us, and they're moral questions.
Yes.
And I think this is probably what parents are most afraid of is, oh, please don't ask me this kind of question. It's like, I don't want to have to answer this. Talk a little bit about these types of questions, and if
Yeah.
you want to use the example on the screen to give us some
Yeah.
principles, be my guest.
There is a time to clear up misinformation. And so when I look, just addressing it very quickly with this question, can Catholics get a tattoo? Often teenagers will point to, they've heard in the Bible, and it's Leviticus. It's Leviticus 19:28. Thou shalt not get a tattoo. I am the Lord your God. Right. And I think it's so in a culture that, particularly on social media, we have to recognize there's a lot of literal information going around out there.
Mm.
And we do have an opportunity to correct that. When this question came up in our household, I was able to say, you know what? It's important for us to recognize that this particular piece in the Old Testament was written to address idolatry, right?
Okay.
And so, literally marking our bodies for other false gods.
Mm.
We as Catholics believe the body is sacred. You can get a tattoo,
Okay.
but it should be in keeping with not offending God, yourself, or others, right? So
Mm.
simple principles there. But Joe, just to kind of go up to the bigger issue around
Yeah.
moral questions, a few
Mhm.
things. First of all, these are often the most difficult conversations that we will have with our children,
Yeah.
because they are thinking about somebody in particular, usually.
Mhm.
And again, this is where the child can Google questions and get information. Sometimes it's wrong, sometimes it's inaccurate, and you can clear that up. But it's an opportunity for you to shape your child's experience of God. And so I think parents can be very afraid of that. And I
Yeah.
would say that's okay, right?
Okay.
And I would say one simple tip, if you're faced with a question like that, is to say something as simple as, this is an important question. And this is at the heart of pain and suffering in the world. And let's just, I'm going to take a moment right now. We're going to pray about that. First of all, it centers the conversation
Mm-hmm.
in a prayer. It can be just very simple, like, God, please be with us as we talk about this issue.
Yeah.
And then to talk about the importance of this question. So again, reframing back, why are we talking about tattooing today? Why are we talking about why, suffering happens, why
Mm-hmm.
bad things happen to good people?
Yeah.
Get to the point of pain. That's what I call it, the POP, and try and get behind that to what's driving the question.
Very important. And so much of what you're saying is striking me as how we respond and what they're going to perceive from how we're responding. Not necessarily what are the words we're saying. Do I have the correct answer? But acknowledging the importance of it, acknowledging the moment, acknowledging the curiosity, the depth that's going on,
Mm-hmm.
that is very validating for a young person to have an adult validate their deep
Mm-hmm.
thinking, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because and there's a couple of questions in the chat that point to this. Children perceive injustice and unfairness very quickly.
Mm.
And
Yes.
so they want to talk about, so distinguishing between fairness and justice is often an important concept as your children age. We want
Hmm.
everything to be the same. But just as different gifts have been given to us, also with that is going to come different levels of suffering. And
Hmm.
I think when it gets to things like, why did my grandma have to die? She was
Yeah.
so good. The point of pain is not actually God taking her away. It's the loss of that relationship.
Yeah.
And so listening and spending some time talking about, let's talk about the good things that grandma brought into our family, and let's remember her, and to slow down and not be too quick to rush to answer the question, but to sit with the experience, which is one of real grief and loss, and to really unpack that. Because I think as parents, sometimes we forget that, because we want to give them everything. And I realize this,
Yeah.
Joe, like, we do so much for our children, and I think the Eucharist gives us an answer here. I
Mm.
remember watching my son go up to receive his first Eucharist for the first time, and I wanted him to have this experience so much, and I wanted it to be meaningful, but I also wanted him to treat this importantly. And, he was all nervous and not sure what to do. I
Yeah.
wanted him to get it right. And I realized you can't take the Eucharist for anyone else. He has
Hmm.
to step forward for that. And
Mm.
so this is a great principle with our faith. We can guide, we can lead, we can make connections, but ultimately our children have to grasp this themselves. And so let's not take that away either. That's where that great journey of self-discovery is.
Absolutely, and beautifully put. We're going to take some questions in just a moment, and what I'd like you to do, Julianne, before we do get to a couple of questions, I'd like you to do two quick things. One is, can you respond to the notion that sometimes when children ask a question, they're really not asking a question at all. They're making a statement. Uh, so like why do bad things happen? Um, that sometimes our best answer is, I know this really hurts, doesn't it? That
Yeah.
it's simply acknowledging that they're expressing hurt more than asking for a theological answer. Can you speak to that for just a moment?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that's why I actually wrote the survival guide for parents, was it because I have quite a bit of formal theological training, as do you, Joe. And in the face of some of the questions that really tug at our hearts, um, a theological response isn't always the best response. And in fact, I was really grappling with this for a while. And I said to my husband, I went to grad school for theology for blah 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 6 years, and I said to him, and I'm struggling with this. And he turned to me, and goes, "What do you think I feel like, Julianne? Do you know how I have to feel?"
Mm.
And so, what has been helpful for us is to draw upon each other,
Mm.
is to say, Wayne, how would you answer this? Because I can't be always the one, right? And I'm
Yeah.
not. And I think it's true too for us is to look at the presence of people in our lives, good mentors, good guides to help us. And again, if a child is making a statement, talk about that. You just said something really powerful. Even if it's not accurate, not right, that is very powerful. We're
Yeah.
going to talk about that because just like us, sometimes children just want to vent,
Yeah.
and we need to be a safe place for that.
Absolutely. Um, we're going to move to some questions now, and Julianne, I know you want to express a few thoughts about this notion of it's our time to rise and shine. Can I ask you to save that for your closing
Sure.
thoughts? So
Yeah.
we'll come back to this, but Denise has joined us. Hi, Denise, and I'm sure you've sifted through. Looks like you have a good handful of questions there. Take it away.
Hi. Yes, we do have a good number of questions, and some of them are also people sharing questions they've received.
Hmm.
But we'll start with this is a representative from Holy Family Parish. Is there a line between kids' questions that it's appropriate for a catechist to field during a session and others that ought to be saved for parents to answer? And how should catechists respond when a child brings a better for parents question to them?
That's a great insight. I think, yes, there are, and I think Jesus teaches us the way here. When he met with Nicodemus, he met with him in private, right? So, and then he did address other questions in public. I think it's okay for the catechist to say, John, that is a great question. Here's a little answer, because I think you're listening for this, but I'm going to really encourage you to talk to your mom or dad or your grandma about this. But I also think help your catechist to follow up. So I think it's very hard for a parent when they come home, they're like, what are you talking about in your religious ed class if you're asking and answering questions like this? Pop the parent a note or walk out to the parking lot and say, hey, Mary, John asked a really interesting question tonight. I just want you to know, here's how I handled it. But that's really insightful. I encourage you to talk about it. That's where we can close the gap between going to church and seeing the domestic church as the place where those conversations are happening. That's a great question.
Wonderful. Take it away.
All right. One of our anonymous attendees asks, what if our kids aren't convinced with our answers?
They're not always going to be convinced, and we need to be okay with that, right? What I think we're talking about sharing is not precision always. We're trying to aim for accuracy, but maybe not always be precise and perfect. But what we're trying to go for is authenticity. And I think acknowledging, I can tell that you're not buying it. Let's talk about why.
I like
and
that.
I think that itself can be a great conversation.
Yeah, I like that. I think it's good to check and say, so does that make sense to you? And if they say no, okay, well, I'm going to need a little more time perhaps to look further into this and get back to you. But thanks for asking. This is
Yeah.
challenging, but yeah, it's great to acknowledge that.
Or even, what were you hoping to hear? If you didn't like the answer, what were you hoping to hear?
I like that.
Again, using the question to reframe, great tactic.
Great. We have time for some more.
Okay. Someone from the Center for Faith and Justice, you addressed this a little bit, but as asking for tips for helping children respond to current events and injustices they're seeing in their communities and the world.
That's a great one, particularly with all the unrest in the world. And I would say the question is very much colored by the age of the child and how much information that you want to get into. If it's younger, I think you can acknowledge, and I think acknowledgement is important. Yes, there is a war happening. Yes, you might hear about it on the news. Here's our response to that as people of peace. And again, is there a connection with prayer that you can make here? I can tell you're bothered by this. Should we pray for all those who've been affected? Yes. When it gets to older questions, particularly with teenagers, again, those questions around fairness and justice, as they are defining their identity, they're watching encroachment on identity of others. And so it's not even the question of a just or an unjust war or any of that, but it's making sense of the meaning, right? It's making sense of, why is this happening? It's getting back to those questions around suffering. So I think, don't be afraid. I think parents are sometimes like, well, what if I don't know the technical root of the conflict? And that's not what the question is about. It's again about the broader perspective on war and unrest and injustice, and lean into that and have that conversation.
I really like one thing that you've done a number of times, Julianne, is that you have often turned these questions uh, into an opportunity for prayer, and how, especially if we're having difficulty answering a question, not that that's an escape hatch, but it is
No.
a way of putting it into a context and saying, okay, we're not done with this yet, but
Mhm.
would you like to, can we pray about this? That it sanctifies it. I just think that's a wonderful piece of advice to give people, that, and precision is one thing, but how we're putting this into a context of a relationship with God is
Mhm.
wonderful advice for
Mhm.
parents.
And Joe, if I can pick up on that, also a teacher actually taught me this. She said, if you don't know the answer, pull out your phone or your computer and sit down with your young person and say, okay, you're troubled by what's happening in this country. I don't know a lot about that myself. Let's look up and see what some of the nuances around.
Mm,
That way we can understand more deeply together. That shows humility, right?
yeah.
And it shows you're willing to seek the answers together rather than to be the all omnipotent source of knowing. It's okay for children to see that you are learning together with questions.
Great advice. Denise, do you have one more you can offer Julianne?
Sure. Um, how do you explain to older students an understanding of how religion and spirituality connect when it's someone that says, "Oh, I'm spiritual"?
Oh, I'm going to use something Joe and I talked about a couple of years ago in the Catechist Backpack. So the word religion, the root of that word in Latin, ligare, means to knit or bind together. Ligare. So ligaments, right,
Mm,
hold parts of us together, right? So religion has become, and Joe, I want you to chime in here because we've talked about this quite a bit as well. What young people are often asking about in that question is the distinction between formal institutional faith and my own way of being in the world. And I think if you can look at those not as opposing concepts, but as complementary, and to recognize that we have a spirit, we have a soul spark within us that finds expression in how we live out our faith. And our religion is knit into every part of our life like a ligament. It holds things together. And so listen for that with young people. Joe, any words of wisdom? We've talked about this one a lot.
absolutely. And I think when you talk about our religion, that means more than our doctrines. Okay, that's a part of it, but it's our practices. And I think one of the great ways that parents pass along their religion to their children is through practices. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that that's one of the ways that that my wife and I are reaching our grandchildren is, at Christmas time, we have a Polish tradition of, it's called opłatki, and breaking a
Mm.
wafer at the table, passing it around, wishing each other, and it's like a communion wafer. And the kids remember this now from year to year. So they remember that tradition. As soon as we put up our nativity scene, they come running to lay under the tree. We put it under the tree, and they look at it and they say, they identify all the characters. So, passing on your faith is more than passing on doctrines and precise answers. It's it's passing on a vision for life, and our practices are a very
Mm.
powerful way of doing that. So yeah, thanks
That's
for letting me
beautiful.
chime
That
in.
that goes back to what we talked about in the beginning too, which is not talking about the faith, the Catholic faith, but this is
Yeah.
our faith. This is our faith home. This is our faith community. So making it really personal. I think sometimes sometimes because of fear or whatever, we use impersonal language like,
Yeah.
yes, what does the Catholic Church teach us? But what does our faith help us understand? And you did that so beautifully with your traditions, Joe, in talking about this is how our family lives this out.
Yeah, take
It's really
ownership
beautiful.
of it. Yeah. Denise, thank you so much. Great job as usual handling the questions and giving them to Julianne. Thank you. All right. Julianne, I'm going to go back to this slide because you had something you wanted to share about this notion of our time to rise and shine, and the notion of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And while you're answering that, I'm going to put this information up on the screen so people can see the book. But give us your last words about, why is this our time to rise and shine?
It is. I think it's it's a hugely important time for us in shaping the lives of our children. And I think, just like the resurrection, Jesus rested in the tomb and then he rose from the dead. I wanted to use that metaphor of rise and shine. Let's not be afraid of the questions that our children are asking, but lean in and embrace them. And uh, I promised you some wisdom from another parent, and this is from Mary and Nick. And this is what Mary said. And I think this is so beautiful. I have found that instilling faith in children is much less formal than I expected. Before having children, I believed rigorous catechesis would inspire lasting faith. Turns out it happens in the most mundane moments. Blessings at school drop offs, praying for friends and family in need, sharing the meaning behind my favorite scriptures and hymns at Mass, dropping off a meal for a family that's sick. The challenge of parenting Catholic kids comes down to Jesus' challenge for us all to have faith like a child.
Mm, beautiful. Amen. Julianne, thank you so much. Your wisdom, as always, is so heartfelt. It's inspiring. It's pastoral. It speaks to everyday living, and you've provided us with a number of tips in this webinar. But more so, you pointed to the fact that your book is chock full of more of these tips. And so, thank you for writing the book. Thank you for sharing it, and thank you for being with us today, Julianne.
Oh, you're so wonderful. And for those that did not have their questions addressed, there's some sticky ones here. I do address some of the really tough ones in there. And with the book comes some guides that you can work through to help you grow in confidence with your faith. We wanted to make sure that it was really practical for you. So I just pray that this time was valuable. And I'm just grateful for every person that came and spent time having tea or coffee with me this morning.
I love it. Ditto, Julianne, to everything you just said about our attendees today. Thank you all for being here. The book is The Catholic Parent's Survival Guide, Straight Answers to Your Kids' Toughest Questions by Julianne Stans. You'll see the QR code on the screen. You can scan that and go right to the information to acquire the book. You can call or visit store.loyolapress.com. You can call our customer service, 800-621-1008, and during business hours, speak to an actual live human being to take your order. And just a reminder once again that the recording will be available to all people who registered. You'll receive a link in an email, and it will also be available soon at loyolapress.com. Julianne, I'll see you at work on Monday, huh?
Yes, I know we're working remote, and that's so beautiful. What a gift to be able to be home with my family at this time in my life and to be able to collaborate with you, Joe. It's been such a gift, and thank you, everyone. As we say in Ireland, Slán agus beannacht, which means goodbye and God bless.
Thank you very much, Julianne, and I will echo that. Goodbye and God bless.